Okay, lesson 17 is all about something called the aggregate market. And this is sort of now the heart of macroeconomics. We're going to begin taking all the pieces and parts that we've learned and begin to put them together. And remember that our objective is to eliminate, to the extent possible, inflation and unemployment. But to understand how we do that, we sort of need a roadmap. And the aggregate market is going to be our roadmap for the rest of the semester. Now, we'll start with a quick definition here. The word aggregate itself generally means the sum of parts. In other words, bring lots of things together. In microeconomics, we talked a lot about markets, but I want to show you how the aggregate market is a little different. For starters, we're referring to the aggregate market, and why is that? Well, the reason for that is that the aggregate market is only one market. You know, in microeconomics, we talked about markets for lots of different things. The market for apples, the market for land, the market for t-shirts, the market for jelly beans. And in each of those markets, they each had their own price and their own output. Well, in macroeconomics, we're trying to look at the economy as a whole. So we're not looking at individual markets. We want to look at the overall market. And that's why we can say the aggregate market. We're going to look at one market for the entire economy. Now, just like in microeconomics, what are the two variables we want to consider? We want to consider price, and we want to consider how much we're going to produce, our quantity or our output. The problem is in macroeconomics, it doesn't make sense to really measure price because you would ask yourself, well, the price of which good? We produce hundreds, millions of goods and services in this country. So to say one specific price doesn't make sense. So instead, we use the term price level. In other words, in general, where are our prices? Are prices rising? Are prices low? And additionally, it doesn't make sense to really say output specifically, at least meaning quantity of one good, because again, we're measuring lots of goods. So we just happen to luck out and already have something that conveniently measures the sum total value of all the things we produce. And we learned that in our last lesson. It was called the GDP. But specifically, because we want to know its real value, we're going to refer to it as the RGDP. It sometimes is also referred to as output still. But again, we're not measuring the output of any one individual product. We're measuring the output of the entire economy. All right, now let's take a quick look. Just like in a micro market, we have an aggregate, we have a demand curve, and we'll call it the aggregate demand curve because again, it's the sum parts of all the things that we demand in an economy. It is downward sloping, and we'll talk about why that is in just a second. We'll also note that we have an aggregate supply curve, and just as a quick note, it's actually called the short run aggregate supply curve. We'll get into more of that later. Makes you think there must also be a long run aggregate supply curve, and there is, but we'll get to all that later. For right now, we're going to notice that it's also upward sloping generally, just like supply curves were in our micro markets. And again, we'll get into a little bit more why that is later. Just a few things we want to note, just like in our micro markets, the equilibrium point is going to be called our equilibrium price, but in this time it's called equilibrium price level and equilibrium output. All of this, I imagine, looks quite familiar to you if you've gone through Module 2 already. But remember, now we're just looking at the sum of everything that we produce as opposed to looking at individual markets. Okay, let's start by taking a little more detailed look at the demand curve. Again, here's the aggregate demand curve. It slopes downward. And again, just like in microeconomics, we want to notice that at a certain price level, there would be a certain amount of output that people demand. So at a certain price, there's a certain amount of output that people consume. Okay, and we'll notice that just like in micro, when the prices fall, in this case, the price level falls, the RGDP is going to increase. Very similar, and that is a change, again, in the quantity of aggregate demand. If price levels fall, RGDP is going to increase. If price levels fall, the amount that people are interested in, the amount of RGDP people are interested in demanding increases. Now that's not a surprise given what demand curves usually look like, but we might wonder why that is specifically. So the reason this occurs is actually has three different reasons. And you'll notice again that the aggregate demand curve is sloping downward. So the question we're really asking is, Why is it that as prices decrease, in general, people have an interest in consuming more RGDP? Well, there's a few. The first is what's called the wealth effect. And the wealth effect tells us something very simple. It says that as prices decrease, the real value of a consumer's income increases, so they can spend more. So think about that. As prices decrease in general, the $10 they had in their pocket used to only be able to buy, let's say, 2 meals at McDonald's. But as prices come down, now they can buy 3, and therefore they demand more RGDP. Again, as prices come down, in effect makes people more wealthy so they can spend more. That's called the wealth effect. The second one is what's called the interest rate effect. Now, I know at this point we don't know a lot about interest rates. I think in general, most people probably know that they have to do with money that you're charged for a loan. And with that alone, we should be able to make enough sense out of this. And what it says is this: lower prices reduce interest rates, which makes borrowing and spending easier. Exactly why lower prices reduce interest rates, we're not going to get into just yet. But if you remember back to our unit on inflation, we noticed that one of the people that was hurt by inflation were banks. So what do banks do? Generally, when prices rise, they raise interest rates. Well, conversely, if prices come down, so do interest rates. That makes it easier to borrow money and therefore easier to spend money on RGDP. So that's called the interest rate effect. Lower prices, lower interest rates, which makes borrowing easier. The last one I'm going to have to ask you at this point, just to take my word on it. This is called the exchange rate effect. We don't know enough about exchange rates yet to completely grasp this one. We'll understand this better in the semester, but just briefly, what we know, for reasons we'll get into later in the semester, is that when prices fall, net exports increase. And remember that RGDP, the last component of RGDP, is NX, or net exports. So if prices fall, net exports increase. And again, we'll get back to that later on and explain that in better detail later in the semester. I would not say any of these three points here are particularly of paramount importance, but it's good to know them and good to understand them. Okay, let's now move to the aggregate supply curve, or as I said, the short run aggregate supply curve. And by the way, there's a number of ways to actually draw this graph. You can shorthand this graph by writing short run aggregate supply curve, SAS, AS, SRAS. Any of those are acceptable notations. And again, what did we learn? Just like in microeconomics, we know that the price and the output, as prices decrease, then the amount of supply that suppliers are willing to produce, the amount in this case of RGDP they're willing to supply, will decrease. Okay, so as prices decrease, RGDP supplied decreases. And of course, the opposite's also true. In other words, if prices are lower, producers are willing to produce less. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, and this can get a little bit tricky. Okay, this is in a little bit of debate, and actually we'll spend some time later this semester looking at some folks who don't specifically agree with these two particular theories. But why the aggregate supply curve does have this upwards positive slope is a matter of debate, and most economists tend to agree with these two bullet points, or at least some version of these two bullet points. Okay, the first is what's called the sticky wage theory. And again, in macroeconomics, we do a lot of theorizing. It's not as definitive and concrete as if you take a microeconomics class where everything seems to come in laws. Here we have a lot of theories, but here's what the sticky wage theory says. And again, what are we trying to understand? Why is it that prices and the amount we produce have a positive relationship? They go the same direction. Why is that? Well, here's what the sticky wage theory says. It says, now follow this, that wages adjust to changing economic conditions more slowly than prices do. Now let's just stop there for a moment. Is that true? Well, it tends to be. If inflation occurs, for example, what does someone at, let's say, the gas station have to do in order to raise their prices? Well, more or less, they just have to go out to the sign out front and raise the price. Now, it's not always quite that simple. There's sometimes a little bit more complicated things than that. But in general, changing the price of goods and services is not too difficult. It can happen fairly quickly. So if a lot of inflation occurs, most businesses can pretty quickly pick up the difference. The problem is workers can't always adjust their salaries nearly as quickly. Most workers negotiate their wages over a period of time. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe as much as 10 years. And once those wages are in place, that's sort of it. So here's the thing. If prices go higher than they expected them to, what happens? Well, when a worker negotiates its contract, knowing that he or she is going to be stuck with that wage for a while, he or she generally tries to guess what inflation is going to be. Well, if inflation ends up being much higher than that, then the value of the salary they negotiated is much less, which means the business has a lot more money to free up to produce more. So, as it says there in the definition, so higher wages means higher prices mean lower real wages. And that allows to use the extra money for the firm to produce at lower cost and therefore produce more. The opposite would also be true. If the wages came in very low, if prices came in very low, then the wages would actually be worth more, which would mean it would be more expensive for the producers to produce, and therefore they'd have to produce less. The fact that wages don't move as quickly as prices, in other words, they're sticky, because that's true, we think people have to guess. And in guessing, higher prices gives an advantage to the producers. Lower prices takes away that advantage from the producers and forces them to produce less. The key point here is just how sticky are those wages. Most economists don't believe they're, for lack of a better term, stuck, meaning they can adjust. And most economists don't believe that they're completely what we call flexible. We'll get to the people who do believe that a little later in the semester, but for all of this semester, unless we discuss otherwise, we're going to stick with this theory that we're sort of in the middle, that as prices rise, our GDP, the supply of our GDP is going to increase. By the way, sort of the junior brother of the sticky wage theory is what's called the sticky price theory. And that says that because some prices adjust more slowly to economic conditions than other prices, those with lower prices attract more customers and increase production in response. So some prices can't pick up as quickly. So for example, if you go to two restaurants and one's prices can be adjusted by just pushing a button, everything's digital, they'll adjust their prices pretty quickly. But other people in the restaurant business who have printed menus may not be able to adjust those prices as quickly because they're always having to reprint their menus then. In fact, literally, the term for the cost of changing prices, the literal cost of making new prices available to your customers, is called a menu cost. So the restaurant that isn't able to adjust its price, when those prices rise, that other restaurant becomes much more expensive. And so more people will come to the lower priced restaurant, and therefore more RGDP is produced. Okay, that one's not quite as important as the sticky wage theory. And I would encourage you to review these two once or twice. The really important part is to understand that in both cases, the reason the supply curve slopes upwards is because some prices and some wages don't adjust instantly to changes in inflation. Okay, and just very quickly, we want to look at what an aggregate demand increase looks like. We're going to be needing both these pieces of information. We're going to do it quickly because we've done this in micro and it looks quite similar. Here's your initial aggregate demand curve and a supply curve. Obviously, you see your equilibrium price and quantity. By the way, please note, or output I should say, please note that we are labeling it now with a P1 and a Y1. We're not going to write RGDP every single time we're labeling a point on an axis. Here's our new aggregate demand curve. This one happens to be an increase, and we know what happens as aggregate demand increases, price levels rise, and our GDP increases. Now, importantly, we also know that we're really looking at these things because we worry about inflation and unemployment. That's really the things we're trying to assess, isn't it? Well, what we're going to do right now is begin to tie the two variables to those problems. Not surprisingly, the variable tied to inflation is the price level. In this case, what we notice is prices are rising. And so because prices are rising, inflation is increasing. If prices rise, inflation increases as well. We're also going to notice that our GDP increased. And because our GDP increased, we are producing more stuff and therefore employing more people, and therefore unemployment decreases. Anytime this is true, if prices rise, inflation occurs. If if our GDP increases, unemployment decreases. So an increase in aggregate demand causes inflation and unemployment to decrease. Let's try another one. Let's say aggregate demand decreased. All right, there's our aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. There's our initial equilibrium. And by the way, sometimes we'll refer to that as our current price and our current output. Aggregate demand decreases, and what do we notice? Prices decrease and our GDP decreases. And because of that, what we notice is that inflation has actually dropped and unemployment has increased. And again, why? Because as prices came down, the definition of inflation of prices coming down is inflation decreasing, and our GDP, as we produce less things, we don't need to employ as many people, and so unemployment is decreasing. So aggregate demand decreases, prices decrease, inflation decreases or deflation occurs, and our GDP as it decreases, unemployment increases. Let's try the supply side. Here's a supply curve. This is going to be a supply decrease. Again, there's our initial price in our GDP. Supply decreases. What happens? Price increases, therefore inflation increases, and our GDP decreases, therefore unemployment increases. We'll summarize this all in a second. And lastly, an aggregate supply increase. There's our initial price and output. There's our new price and output. And what's going to happen? Because prices came down, inflation will decrease. And as our GDP increased, unemployment will decrease. So you're starting to get a feel for now, I think, what we're really trying to accomplish. This is how we ultimately try to eliminate or at least control inflation and unemployment, by manipulating aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And we'll talk about how we do that in upcoming lessons. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with a little summary chart. I'll stop the recording at this time, but it may be a good idea to jot this chart down and begin to familiarize yourself with it. We're going to need to get comfortable with the idea. It should be fairly easy for us to now say, and for you to know, if aggregate demand increases, I know that prices are going to rise, and therefore inflation is going to rise, and our GDP is going to increase, and therefore unemployment is going to decrease, and so on and so forth.